Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by offering you a warm welcome to the second presentation of the President's Special Lecture Series on Pandemics. As we all know, the era of the coronavirus global pandemic has been among the most challenging periods in recent history for many of us, certainly for Stevens, for our general area in New Jersey, New York, and for society at large. As a community of scholars and academics, we always strive to understand this experience in the context of history and of course through other lenses as well, science, engineering, information technology, economic, and others. For those of you who joined us, you know that last month we were fascinated by a talk by Dr. Rohit Chitali of DARPA on tools of the trade in the context of pandemics. And today we're very fortunate to host Dr. Frank Snowden for his talk entitled COVID-19, Why Were We So Unprepared? And I know that many of you, like myself, are impatiently waiting to get the answer to why we were so unprepared. This is obviously a fascinating topic, and as of earlier today, we had 345 people who had registered for this event, and I'm delighted to see this lecture series is generating this level of interest among our members of our community and friends of the university. Let me say a few words about Dr. Snowden. Dr. Snowden is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine at Yale University. He taught at London University and Yale University from 1975 until 2018 and served as chair of history and history of science and medicine at Yale for 7 years. He attended Harvard College and earned his Doctor of Philosophy degree from Oxford University. Dr. Snowden has an unbelievably illustrious resume, and if I wanted to even cover a small fraction of it, I would have to dedicate the whole hour to it. So let me just say that Dr. Snowden's principal publications in the field of medicine and public health are, I will mention three major publications: Naples in the Time of Cholera, 1884 to 1911, The Conquest of Malaria, Italy, 1900 to 1962, and Epidemics and Society, from the Black Death to the present. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in offering an enthusiastic, of course, virtual round of applause to welcome Dr. Frank Snowden. Dr. Snowden, thank you very much, and take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, and what a very generous introduction indeed. I was sort of looking behind me to see exactly whom you were talking about. In any case, I'm delighted to be with you, and thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. What I'd like to do is to talk about epidemics and their influence on society as a beginning, and then turn to COVID-19 for, should we say, the second half of our talk, mostly after the middle question period, about halfway through. So that's kind of the way I'd like to organize the talk. I thought that it would be good to give some idea of the impact of epidemic diseases from historical examples, so that then we can raise the question of how we were or weren't prepared, and also the question of what's the likely impact of COVID-19, i.e., is it a reasonable idea to have the expectation that we'll go back to the normality before the onset of the epidemic, or are there likely to be long-lasting changes that either will or should be made? So during the first half, I'll be talking as a historian. And the second half, I'll be using a little bit of a crystal ball and hoping that I'm not completely off the mark. So for the beginning, I thought I'd give two examples from the past of major experiences with pandemic disease, so that then after we've looked at those for a few minutes, we can turn to the experience of COVID-19 to see if it's likely to be as consequential as other examples. And we'll be concerned with questions such as, will this pandemic of COVID-19 just disappear so that we can return to normality? How soon will that be when we have a vaccine, say from Moderna or Pfizer? What, if any, changes will there be that are lasting and may indeed possibly be positive? Will historians 100 years from now think that this coronavirus was a turning point in the history of the 21st century? So now I'd like to go back quite a ways in time, in fact, to antiquity, and I'd like to think for a few minutes about the impact of the plague of Athens, with the first caveat that the plague of Athens, which was 430 to 428 before the Common Era, wasn't actually what we mean now by plague at all. And there's been a long controversy for an extended period of time of what disease it was. Excavations have, from the pulp of victims of the plague from funeral burial pits of that time, have been able to establish DNA evidence of typhoid, not modern typhoid, but a much more virulent ancestor of typhoid. And that may not be sufficient. It may be that there were two diseases, two comorbidities that were unleashed on Athens at the same time. In any case, our source for this is Thucydides and his wonderful history of the Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 BC to 404. Now, in the microcosm of classical Greece, the Peloponnesian War is one that we might decide to call a world war. That is, it was an all-out conflict between the two great powers of the Greek world. On the one hand, Sparta and its allies, Sparta being the great land power of the period, a great militaristic and authoritarian city-state. In fact, the business of Sparta was making war, and all of its male citizens devoted to their lives to that project. So it and its allies formed one side in the Peloponnesian War, and Athens and its allies, the other. Athens, unlike Sparta, was the great naval power. It was the great democracy. It was a state that was open, unlike Sparta, to immigration from other city-states. And we see then on the one side, the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, the Delian League led by Athens. Now in this world war, Attica, the region around Athens, was besieged and invaded by the Peloponnesian League. It was surrounded, and refugees from Attica flooded into the city, and it's thought that the population of the city expanded with this influx of people from well over 100,000 people to well over 300,000. So the city tripled in size. And the result of that was massive crowding. Thucydides reports that people were sleeping everywhere, in the temples and the streets, that there was no unoccupied space, with a great collapse of hygiene and of law and order. Now, those are conditions that, as you can well imagine, are perfect for epidemic diseases, and especially for an epidemic of the type like typhoid, which is spread by the oral fecal route in an unhygienic urban environment by contaminated food and water. So the pandemic, and I want to stress that it was a pandemic, Thucydides tells us that it arrived, possibly began in Ethiopia or Lower Egypt, spread through North Africa and over throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and through Persia. And it then invaded the Greek peninsula, Greece, from the outside. So it was genuinely an international pandemic in this sense, and it ravaged the city and did so for several years. Now, what was the impact of this catastrophe? I would argue that it was profound and comprehensive, also permanent. Athens did not go back to its preceding normality. First, of course, there was a demographic disaster, and Athens may have lost up to half of its population. And this tremendous carnage profoundly affected the outcome of the war. That is to say, by 404, Athens had been defeated, and it never regained its place as a hegemonic power in the Greek classical world, and that role fell instead to Sparta. So we see a geopolitical shift of power as a result of this disease. We see that the disease had a decisive impact on the outcome of the war. The plague of Athens also affected regime change. That is to say, that we witness the collapse of democracy in the city. Pericles himself, the great democratic leader, is rejected by the citizenry, and then he dies. So we see that Athens ceases to be the great democratic city-state of Greece. We also see religious change. Thucydides tells us there was a collapse of morality, of morale, and also specifically of the belief system that the Athenians held, for the reason that the Athenians kept making sacrifices to the gods and invoking their help against Sparta and against the disease, and prevailed. There was no assistance that was provided, and so they believed that the gods had turned on them, that they had been deserted by Olympus, and that they therefore ceased to practice and believe in their traditional religions. Something that sounds like a very familiar tale is there was an upsurge of xenophobia in Athens. Until this time, Athens had been the great city-state to which citizens from other city-states in Greece were free to migrate and become citizens of Athens, and their descendants would enjoy full citizenship and all of the rights pertaining thereto. In this period, there was instead a revolt against outsiders, the medics as they were called, and laws were passed that deprived them of their citizenship and the citizenship rights also of their descendants. So I would argue that the case of the plague of Athens is a clear example of the massive impact of an epidemic disease can have, and the comprehensive effects it had on life in ancient Greece. I then wanted to take a second example, and that I think it would be important to take an example that is the example that everyone has of the worst case scenario of epidemic disease, and that's the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, as you know, is spread by rats and fleas. It can also spread pneumonically, that is through the air by droplets. It originated from animal reservoirs in Central Asia and was then transmitted above all by warfare through the Mongol Empire that then spread, the war making, both east and west, and also then by trade through the Mediterranean. So the plague spread across Asia. It really was an international pandemic. And I think recent research has led people to be less Eurocentric in their view of the bubonic plague, which is to say it spread across Asia, it spread across Europe, across the Middle East. And what's newly uncovered is that it also devastated East Africa and West Africa below the Saharan desert, which served more as a highway than as a protective barrier from the bubonic plague. Now, Western Europe experienced successive waves from 1347, when it broke out in Sicily at Messina, and the waves came to a halt in Western Europe in 1743, when the last outbreak scourged the city of Messina yet again. Now, bubonic plague was not in any ways at an end. We have a different pandemic that comes in the late 19th century and particularly ravages the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, although it also reaches many other places across the globe. And then it establishes reservoirs that are still with us. And indeed, the bubonic plague still kills 10, 20, 25 people a year, even in the United States today, in the Southwest, where there is, among prairie dogs and other wild rodents, a reservoir of the disease that's still active. So the disease is by no means entirely gone. This disease caused a population catastrophe. Half the population of Western Europe died. It led to profound effects on religion. One was, just as in ancient Greece, there arose doubts about theodicy, that is, the relationship of an omniscient and benevolent deity to human beings. How could such a God allow the killing of untold numbers of innocent children, for example, who were free of sin? And how could this be unfolding? The same question that's raised in the book of Job. Similarly, on the other side, there was a great upsurge among many of religiosity, pilgrimages, plague saints, the cult of those Saint Roch, Saint Sebastian, who absorbed the arrows of the plague into his own flesh to act as a human shield for humanity, and the Virgin Mary were all thought to be willing to intercede with an angry deity. And so they formed a new series of cults in this period. In art and painting are profoundly affected in all sorts of ways. Painting, sculpture, architecture, we see across Europe. Venice, for example, its landscape, the cityscape, if you go there today, is most prominent are churches built in the 17th century and after to commemorate the saving of Venice from the plague. And the great painting cycle by Tintoretto is dedicated to the plague. If you go to Rome, on the Castel Sant'Angelo, the highest point one can see from the old city, the angel, archangel, there's a statue of at the very top of the castle, and the archangel is sheathing his sword as a sign that God is no longer angry and will spare the city. We get in literature, of course, Boccaccio's Decameron and Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, And even in modern times, we see the great plague film, The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman, who is imagining the nuclear disaster and thinks the closest, this was a film of 1957, the closest you can get to that is what happened to Europe during the plague years. And so that becomes a trope for his anxiety about something even worse. It's a time of great violence, of scapegoating. The early years of the Black Death, in fact, saw the first, if we like, predecessor to the Holocaust. That is to say, a great wave of anti-Semitism swept the Rhineland, France, and various other areas in which both the authorities, it wasn't entirely spontaneous and from below, there were also major authorities took place, trials were held, and Jews were put to death en masse in large areas of Europe. Then there were some more positive results. One of these is public health. City-states of Florence and Venice, because they were the most frequently and most powerfully scourged, began to devise measures to try to control this catastrophe. And many of these we'd recognize today. Things such as they set up what we would call boards of health. They called them health magistrates. These were a board of authorities who had the authority to hold in their hands full executive and legislative power to pass measures to protect the city-states. And those would include the setting up of plague hospitals, setting up quarantine procedures and isolation, establishing and sending out what we would call PPE, providing the hospitals and the quarantine stations with administration, with provisioning, with a police force. Imagine quarantining naval vessels that don't wish to stay for 40 days. That was the quarantine of the period. And so you needed a naval force as well and an administration to run all that. Sometimes there were also sanitary cordons. We see another effect then was its political influence on, I don't want to say there's a one-in-one correspondence between the onset of the plague and the rise of the early modern state, but amongst other factors, the coming of the plague was one of the bases for the centralization of power and the rise of political authorities that would have the authority and the resources to combat this particular disease. And then lastly, I'd like to mention a major impact, which was economic. This will also be familiar for our own time. With this sort of population devastation, there was a shortage of labor. And so we see wages going up, diet going up, as people began who'd never had access to meat before, surely do. Workers now are able to breach the guild barriers and join them. Land is less expensive and people have greater resources, and we see a middle class rising and purchasing land as well. So all of this was an important factor then in the emergence of social mobility, the rise of a middle class, the emergence of manufacturing, and it's part of the background to what then develops as the emergence of manufacturing and in other words, the rise of industrial capitalism. But then I see that this is my historical, those are my two comparative cases before we turn to COVID-19. And I wondered if we should stop now and see if anyone has questions at this point before we move on to what is a somewhat more speculative, conjectural time when we discuss when will we recover? Will we be forever changed? Or what can one learn from the past to shed light on those questions?
Dr. Snowden, thank you very much. I'm going to give our audience a few seconds to send their questions through the Q&A option. I have not received any questions yet. Let's just give it a moment. But your story is fascinating, and your repertoire of knowledge is incredible.
Oh, you're very kind.
I think the questions are beginning to come in. Somebody says we are impatiently waiting for the second half, which is the best section. How did Athens contain the epidemic within the city? That's the first question.
Absolutely. We don't know as much about that as we do, for example, about the bubonic plague, because the sources are limited and our best authority is that of Thucydides. And it seems as though it's rather like a fire that runs out of fuel, and the disease within a limited city ran itself out. And in particular, also, one imagines the impact of seasonality and the fact that possibly hygienic conditions may not have gotten worse and worse as the population shrank and shrank. But there's no definitive answer to what ways the Athenians tried to protect themselves. We know that for later epidemics, but not for this time in Athens.
I have another question, which is rather interesting. The question goes like this: was the scapegoating of the Jews due in part to their higher survival rates? Their religious practices require hand washing on many occasions.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question and a perceptive one. And what I would say, though, is that it probably isn't. And the reason I say that is that places actually began to destroy the Jews in their midst before the plague arrived. And what happened was that places heard of that there was we know from COVID-19 the rate at which conspiracy theories circulate, and we know also that it didn't take social media to allow people to circulate rumors. And there were lots of rumors circulating that what was happening, it was said that the Jews had a plot to destroy Christendom, and that they were poisoning the wells from which Christians drank, so that the plague that was emerging was not a natural event, said these conspiracy theorists. It was a crime, and the only way to stop it was to destroy the Jews and interrupt this diabolical plot before it went any further. So I don't think that that seems to have transcended Jewish practices, and I don't think Christians were thinking, oh, the Jews know something that we don't. There was something else at work that was more sinister and more profound.
Thank you. Believe it or not, I have 18 questions, so we won't be able to cover all of them, but let me just pick and choose a couple more before we go to the second half of your talk. Why do you choose to observe these two cases that you mentioned as opposed to the most recent pandemic in 1918?
Oh, right. Well, let's talk about the more recent epidemic of 1918, which I would say in a way is, I'm glad you raised the question, and I would have turned to it in the second half also, because it's a contrary example. I picked two examples in which pandemic diseases have thoroughly transformed a society. And what's interesting about the 1918 pandemic is that it doesn't do that. Indeed, the standard work on the American experience of the 1918-19 pandemic is entitled America's Forgotten Pandemic. And scholars who've looked in the 1920s note that in the documents of various states, there isn't a trace of the authorities taking cognizance and dealing with the impact of this disease and analyzing its causes and what needs to happen to change the society afterwards. Now, I have a couple of theories as to why this is true. One is what was happening at the time. And that is to say that people were preoccupied with a world war and then with the peacemaking afterwards. And they were preoccupied also with the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power. And in the United States, for example, the Great Red Scare that swept the country after World War I. Those are major considerations. Another has to do with censorship and self-censorship. The disease is called the Spanish Influenza because Spain was a non-belligerent country and it did not censor its press. And so that was the one place in which you could really read about the disease. The other belligerent countries chose to censor themselves and their presses because they were afraid that if one of the enemy nations understood the degree to which the country was being affected and its impact, for example, on manpower and the deployment of troops, it would give them a battlefield advantage. And so they practiced censorship. And that's another reason that people weren't fully informed of exactly what was happening. And then I think the way that this disease moved was another feature. And that is to say that the disease did come in waves. There were three important waves of the Spanish influenza, a mild one, and then the catastrophic second wave. The point is, though, that it moved in a particular way. It moved through a community and it killed enormous numbers of people, but distantly in a sense, in that the case fatality rate in any one place was not that high. It was simply that everyone was infected that led to such a terrible mortality. And it moved very quickly through a community. It didn't lay siege to a community the way the plague of Athens did for months and months at a time, or even for years, the way that bubonic plague did. And I believe that its rapid passage was another feature. And then I think there's a historical memory, which is, to most people, they thought, oh, well, this is just the grip. It's something we all know, it's just the flu, and therefore we can get over this. We don't need to panic. It's not the end of the world. It's not, people don't imagine that everyone's going to die the way they did during the bubonic plague. I think that would be my sort of list of possible conclusions. And one of the ways in which one can measure this is something that strikes me as quite interesting, which is how was this terrible cataclysm memorialized? And let's take the United Kingdom, for example. And there's an infinite number of memorials to the heroes of the war, the First World War, the soldiers. But those other heroes, the doctors, nurses, orderlies, who cared for the victims of this terrible health disaster, there's exactly in the whole of the United Kingdom, I'm informed, one memorial dedicated to the struggle against the Spanish influenza. There's a church in the East End of London that has a stained glass window dedicated to the doctors and nurses. But that seems to be literally the only one in the whole of the country.
Interesting, fascinating. Dr. Snowden, as I said, there are many other questions. I'll just read one of them, but it may be on a topic that you will cover in the second half of your talk. If that is the case, please tell me, in which case I will just go mute and I'll stop my video. And here is the question: what do you think is the greatest similarity between the historic plagues you have mentioned and our current pandemic on a micro level?
The disease that has the greatest similarity. And that's a difficult question. Each epidemic, I believe, has features and characteristics particular to itself. I think there are many people compare, as the questioner did, the Spanish flu with this disease. And there are reasons for doing that, in the sense that it is transmitted through the air. It's a pulmonary disease. And many of the measures that were adopted, if you look at photographs of the Spanish influenza, you see that could almost be today. You see people wearing masks. There were fines for people who coughed or sneezed without covering their faces. There were bans on demonstrations, on gatherings, while churches, schools were closed. That there were all of these sorts of we call it social distancing, and lockdowns were enacted in many, many places. So I think those are the grounds for seeing a similarity in some of the public health response. I would argue, though, and this does take me into the second part of the talk, which is that there is a very profound difference that I would regard COVID-19, if I were to define it, as the first major pandemic disease. There were some dress rehearsals before, but the first major pandemic of the era of globalization. Mm-hmm. And I would like to argue that the Spanish influenza is not that. Although the Spanish influenza circled the planet, that was not actually a novelty and doesn't make it entirely distinct. And I think that the point is that globalization is about massive connectivity. And in 1918 to 19, that did not yet exist. What caused the Spanish influenza to be transmitted was a rather total war, and the mobilization, massive mobilization of armies and their deployment, and also their movement from one place to another. Remember that this was an age before the internet, was an age before the first transcontinental airplane ever took off. And so I don't think we can call the Spanish influenza a predecessor, because I believe the factors that make us vulnerable to COVID-19 are very different ones. And I'd like to look at those that we did not address, although there were warnings. In fact, if you look in the United Kingdom, in 2006, Her Majesty's government commissions a very high-level commission to study and publish the vulnerability of the United Kingdom and South Africa, that is the developed world and the developing world as they saw it, to infectious diseases and pandemics in particular. And the report in 2006 is that, in fact, it is inevitable that epidemic diseases, and they will be undoubtedly zoonotic, and they'll undoubtedly be a pulmonary disease, that they are inevitable in humanity's future, and that as we become more and more interconnected, and as climate change advances and our relationship with the animal world are deformed in various ways, this threat is going to be a mounting one. And yet, the United Kingdom was thoroughly unprepared for this event. Similarly, if we look at the United States, we can say in 1997, after the avian flu, the first, I would argue, upsurge of the globalization era, I would say that at that point, virologists began to say that we're terribly at risk from a viral pulmonary disease. And we also see that Anthony Fauci, whom we all know, in 2005 went to Congress, and he and the head, Julie Gerberding, then the director of the CDC, testified to Congress that you could look at what meteorologists say, and they would tell you, meteorological scientists would say, that we know that if you live in the Caribbean, hurricanes are coming. It's inevitable. We don't know the date, and we can't tell you how strong the winds will be in each case, but if you don't prepare, it's very unwise. He said it's exactly the same with virologists. They can tell you that an epidemic, a major epidemic, even equal to that of the Spanish influenza, or even worse, is inevitable in our future. He can't tell us what day, and he can't tell us what virulence the disease will have, but it's inevitable in our future. And there was, in the wake of that, a number of efforts to mobilize preparedness. But I think, as Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization says, what happened is that people, once it's passed, there's a feast and famine cycle of behavior, and people think, well, I'd rather not raise taxes if I'm a politician, and I'd rather spend on other priorities rather than on medical research, on developing vaccine programs, and equipping ourselves to confront the disease with more access to healthcare. Better instead to spend money in other ways. And so we see that very much takes place. And even so that in 2019, the World Health Organization had commissioned a study of the vulnerability of the world to a pandemic threat. And it was a very, like the British study, a very high level international scientific study of vulnerability. And the report in 2019 is stunning. The report was A World at Risk. So it's, I would say that where are our vulnerabilities? And I would say that in the era of globalization, the risks, diseases do not attack societies in a thoroughly random way. Societies prepare their own pathways that microbes adapted to those pathways exploit in order to make their way through a society. And I believe that the era of globalization has created a number of very wide and ever more frequently traveled highways that a microbe like COVID, the novel CoV-2, the virus, is exploiting as it's making its way through our communities. One of those, and none of these really apply to the world in 1918 to 19. I'm thinking of population size, which is a prerequisite for a disease but of this kind, but not only size in the absolute as we approach 8 billion people worldwide, but its density. And that is a very major feature. Massive urbanization and teeming cities and mega cities, land use change patterns that involve the invasion of animal habitat, so that we get more and more frequent cases of spillover from wild animals to human beings, particularly bats that are, and it's not by chance that China and Southeast Asia, which have such an enormous abundance of species of bats, that carry a whole reservoir of different viruses. And so it's a perfect situation for spillover. Another is part of our industrial development, and that is air pollution, greenhouse gases, and fine particulate matter, which lie, if you're going to think of an ideal way to make a population vulnerable to a pulmonary disease, or one that presents above all as a pulmonary disease, although it's more than that, as we've learned to our cost, poisoning people's lungs with particulate matter and with greenhouse gases leads to comorbidities and makes people vulnerable to COVID-19. So industrial growth and its negative pollution factors. Then I would say interconnectivity by trade, investment, and say the internet. Also mass migrations of people, mass tourism, and air travel. All of these features that did not exist, or there's been at the very least a quantum leap beyond what existed in 1918 and 19. I know by then Orville Wright had flown, but it's nothing like the connectedness where now if a disease were, I'll pick a place on the globe at random almost, if a disease broke out in Jakarta in the morning, by nightfall, it could be present in Los Angeles and London and Dar es Salaam. So that is another source of major vulnerability. And this disease, the course that it followed was to exploit those pathways, and it did so in a very systematic way. So will it affect us in a major and lasting way? And here I let me immediately say that I'll take off my hat as a historian in some ways, and that I want to look a little bit to the future. Are there lessons from the past? And I'll go out on a limb by giving some thoughts about where we're headed.
Dr. Snowden,
yes.
I'm going to go mute and stop my video so that you become the center of attention.
Oh, that's no problem. I'm delighted that you are sharing the screen with me in that way. What I would argue is that there's a very moving statement by a historian recently who said that very often pandemic diseases are a portal from one stage of our development to the next, and that a return to the prior normality, as people call it, is probably not possible usually, and perhaps not desirable. Why perhaps impossible? And then I'll answer the question, why perhaps not desirable? The first thing, why impossible, I'm not taking a picture of gloom here. I don't believe in an apocalypse. This is not an apocalyptic experience, and I don't want to spread panic, gloom, or doom. It just seems to me, however, that this is likely to be a disease that we'll live with for some time to come. And why is that? Because we don't really have the tools to eradicate it. And it looks to me as though, looking at the development of vaccines in the past, that COVID-19 isn't the strongest candidate for a vaccine such as we had from smallpox or polio. That is to say that COVID-19, it seems that we might fear, does not produce a strong, durable immunogenesis, and that the vaccine candidates that we have there will be a vaccine, it will be a useful tool, but we have no reason to think that it's going to be a tool that is a panacea that really makes it possible to eradicate this disease. And there'll be all of the questions also about what do we do in a world where 40% of our country consists of anti-vaccinators who will resist taking such a vaccine. And what will we do about distributing it throughout the world? Because if that doesn't happen, the microbes don't respect borders. And so it seems most certainly that it will return. So I'm not very sanguine about the eradication possibilities in any foreseeable future. And so I think we'll be living with tools of public health that are good and powerful. We'll have a vaccine, we'll have more effective therapeutics, but I don't think the vaccine, it may well not be, I'd rather put it that way, a magic bullet. And it may well be that the remedies that we find therapeutically also aren't. So for those reasons, I feel we may need to contain this disease rather than eradicating it. They will have to learn to think of ways to live with it, to contain it, and make certain that it doesn't surge in the ways that we've seen. And why do I say if it's not entirely likely to be possible to return to the past, why might it not be entirely desirable? And here I want to be an optimist and say that it's not entirely desirable because it's these vulnerabilities that brought us to the place where we are now. And I think we want a world that's safer for our children and grandchildren than the one that ran into this terrible difficulty of COVID-19, particularly since I think Fauci's statement of 2005 that we'll have another pandemic or not a pandemic, or rather say the threat, the challenge of a microbe that could cause the pandemic. And our task then is to prevent that happening, that this challenge will arise again. And I think we need to address the weaknesses that led us to the place where we found ourselves now. And so I like to think, for example, of what's happening in a number of European cities where they're beginning to think that this is the likely way forward. And what needs to happen is that we need to reimagine, to use our imagination to bring people together, to reimagine what a safer city would look like, how it would reconfigure ways of working, ways of shopping, ways of having less environmental pollution that generated comorbidities, that gave greater access to everyone to healthcare. In other words, to reimagine public health and healthcare so that they aren't simply about caring for individual patients and emergency response, but also tackle the long-term vulnerabilities of a society as a whole. That is a task that the Lancet just addressed in a recent issue, and it seems that that might be a very important way in which we can reconfigure our future, and reconfiguring it with reimagining work, reimagining all sorts of aspects of our society, our educational system, our healthcare system, and then I think also tackling the problem of how we relate to other creatures on the planet and establishing much better ways of containing rampant deforestation and also having sentinels posted to detect spillover so that it can be stopped at an early stage and we don't have a second installment of something like COVID-19. So those are, I think, our weaknesses. And that's why I think that we need to be forever changed. And I think that this disease looks as though it's going to be long lasting, that it's besieging us, that we will emerge on top of it with, I hope and believe, strong bulwarks that create a much safer world to leave as a legacy for the future. So that's where my thinking goes, but I'm not actually a prophet, and I could be entirely wrong. And maybe in a future year, I'd like to come back and tell you why I was so dreadfully wrong in my assessment of what I thought was likely to happen. But thank you for allowing me to speculate.
Well, thank you very, very much. This is truly fascinating. I can't imagine that this talk is coming close to its end. Additional questions are pouring in, but I'd like to use my prerogative to ask the first question myself. Dr. Snowden, you mentioned that Dr. Fauci in 2005 briefed the United States Congress and predicted that there will be another microbe that will create the conditions for a pandemic. And I suppose he advocated that we ought to be prepared. Do you believe that we were adequately prepared? And if not, with better preparation, would it have been possible for us to contain the pandemic in the sense that we would have prevented some fatalities and we would have controlled the spread of the virus better than we have?
Right. I think there are two parts to your question, as I understand it. The first part is, were we really so terribly underprepared despite the warning? And to that question, I can give a resounding yes, we were terribly unprepared, not alone. We weren't the only country that was terribly unprepared, but we certainly weren't. And the position in which we find ourselves shows that we had dismantled the structures of preparedness. We had underfunded our research and vaccine efforts. We had a fragmented healthcare system in which millions of people did not have access to care. We had, that was one of our great vulnerabilities, those disparities in access to care. Another was we took it to run, there's a real problem with having a healthcare system that is based on for-profit health, which is that there is a tendency to squeeze out the surge capacity, which is expensive to maintain. And our hospitals had no surge capacity in terms of protocols, PPE, the necessary IC units. We all know the fiasco about testing and about PPE and about ventilators and ICU units. And this is an ideological perspective about cutting health benefits that was rampant throughout the West. It's an advanced industrial approach to this problem, and other countries as well did exactly the same. And we underfunded an institution that we really need, and that's the World Health Organization, and it lacked the resources and the influence. It made, I don't want to say that it did a wonderful job. In some ways it did not, but a well-funded, well-staffed WHO is part of our survival network, and that was lacking. And the fragmentation also applies to the European Union, where each country took a policy of its own. So there was an incoherence to the international response to the disease. And then when the emergency was approaching, I think what the Chinese did was not a model of ideal public health, but they did take measures that were capable and were effective in containing the disease and buying the whole world months of time for preparation. And that preparedness time was squandered, I'm sorry to say. And that's another problem. So this leads on to the second part of your question, whether the catastrophe had to be the one that it is. My view is that we were extremely vulnerable, and this disease was going to come. But had we listened to the British report of 2006 and Gerberding and Fauci's warnings of 2005, and had we set up a careful organization to practice surveillance, to equip our research labs with the funding that they needed, our hospital systems with surge capacity, with expanding our healthcare system. Had all of those things been undertaken, had we addressed the problem of spillover at its source, under the leadership of the WHO, and China also did not do this, and one can see this in the history of the wet markets, for example, and the wild animal trade. So I'm not going to say the Chinese did a flawless example, but had that been done, it does seem that we had a good hope of being able to contain this outbreak at an early stage and to have mitigated the extraordinary catastrophe to our economy and to all of those lives that have been lost and looks as though may well be lost during what looks like a rather frightening winter ahead of us.
Thank you very much. I've got lots of questions. Let me try to pick a few, and I'll try to summarize the questions as best I could. What do you see happening with public gatherings such as concerts, sporting events, etc., in the reimagined world?
Oh, that's yes, I'm glad you asked that. And the first thing I want to say, though, is that when I'm answering it, I'm just putting one mind to the task. And what this is going to take, if we're going to reimagine, I would advise that you fly fast and far from anyone who says that he or she has the answer. This is going to be a period that requires great collective innovation and lots of ideas. But among some of the features that will be needed for cultural events and for sporting events, I think we saw that I don't think that mass gatherings are a great idea. Having people crowded together without social distancing. And I think outdoors events are much better than indoor events. So if there can be outdoor events at distance, I think that is a possibility. One can imagine spectators at sporting events in different ways in the future, and perhaps they'll be further away from the play, but they're present, but can see it perhaps through electronic equipment, the close view of the playing field. It seems to me that there are imaginative ways that one can operate in that sort of way. One would also imagine that one needs for educational institutions, perhaps to reimagine, particularly at higher levels. I'm not a great fan of tele-learning at a young age. I don't think it works very well, but I do think for tertiary education, the idea of a hybrid system where you have some things in well-ventilated, distanced seminars, for example, possibly with people wearing masks and having lots of ventilation, so it's almost as if it were outdoors. I can imagine that happening along with new ways of teaching. I'm an optimist in the sense I don't believe that our culture and our civilization are on the brink of collapsing. I think all that we need is to find ways of preserving them and ways of enjoying them that don't put our lives and safety at risk. That's what I'm arguing for.
Thank you. And the next question is one that I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in the answer that you will give. Do you believe this was an engineered or natural virus? And was it from the wet market or from an accident in a laboratory?
That is an interesting question. And what I would say is that it seems as though some versions of the idea that it began in the Institute of Virology at Wuhan, either by malevolence or by an accident leaking out of the laboratory and spreading around the world, the least that one can say is that there is zero evidence to support that claim. One can imagine whatever scenarios one wishes to invent, but it seems that there's not much point in inventing a scenario for which there are no indications that this actually happened. And indeed, those people who worked in the Wuhan laboratories from other countries have reported that it was as safe a facility as one could possibly imagine anywhere in the world, and that the strains of the virus that have spread around the world are not the ones that in fact were being studied in that institute. So the evidence leans entirely away from its having been coming from a lab, and certainly not from a lab in China, and that's where it started. So I think the chronology for anywhere else simply doesn't work. So I'm not a believer in those theories. And I would like to have, I think science is evidence-based, and we need to have some evidence before ideas like that can begin to have any traction at all. And at the moment, we have no evidence of that. And so I see no reason at all to believe them. Then the next part of the question, oh dear, I think
I think you have answered it. The next part was, did it come out of the wet market or from a laboratory?
That was it, the wet market. And there's a lot of controversy about the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. The point about it is that what's so interesting is that the scientists from the EcoHealth Alliance noticed that there were lots of spillover incidents preceding this catastrophe, and they identified antibodies to this virus in a significant number of people in southern China, relating to the invasion of bat habitat and the relationship of human beings, the spread of sprawl and roads into forests, the international trade in wildlife, that these were leading to these spillover events. And so it may not be that the first index case occurred in the Wuhan wet markets, but it is true that the virus was detected in Wuhan with sea markets. And it's also true that shoppers there fell ill from it. So this did play a role at the minimum in spreading the disease. And it may, whether that was directly from bats to people or through an intermediate like civet cats, like SARS or other animals, pangolins, our suspicions fall on that. But it does seem as though the least one can say is the wet market in Wuhan served to amplify the disease and the danger and to help it spread. I don't think the claim has been or can be substantiated that it originated directly there, but or that was the only, if the market had been closed, this would never have happened. What is more to the point is that this was a danger that was happening and was an ongoing danger, and this was the place in which it was amplified. And I would say that much is true.
Very good. The next question actually is from Professor Teresa MacPhail, whom you might know. She is responsible for actually recommending that you deliver this lecture today. So I want to thank Dr. McPhail, and I feel obligated asking her question.
Well, let me thank Dr. McPhail along with you.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Do you think our past successes in the area of healthcare, such as the development of antibiotics, vaccines, better therapeutics, actually created a false sense of security when the virus first emerged? Did we become overconfident and we didn't learn from our prior experiences with pandemics?
A very interesting question. And my belief is that the industrial world was guilty of profound hubris, that we thought that this is not something that's likely to be a problem in affluent, hygienic societies with robust health infrastructures and the major medical centers to look after us. And so I think there was part of the reason that this, what Dr. Tedros kept calling the window of opportunity of time that China bought the world, it needed to be taken advantage of before the window closed, and we comprehensively failed to do that. And I think that one of the reasons that the West failed to do that was this sense that it's not really, it can't happen here. It won't happen in our country. It may happen somewhere in the developing world, but it's not a threat to the United States or the European Union countries. I do believe that that is, and if one reads some of the comments of this, I think can actually be documented through some of the comments of advisors to the governments involved, really did feel this way. So I do think that there's a kind of vulnerability that's paradoxical here, that our very successes as in science and therapeutics and vaccines caused us to underestimate the danger. And that I think is certainly true. But also there's the opposite of that. And that is, I think we also live in a time that risks becoming the first post-truth society, and that there is a tremendous disregard for science now, for lack of belief in it, the sense that we see there are political movements, certainly in the United States, but also if one looks at the Five-Star Movement in Italy or the nationalist movements in France, they also say that this has everything to do with not with what scientists say, but rather with immigration, with certain ethnic groups, that science is unimportant, that maybe it's even spread. We hear this horrible idea that perhaps the healthcare doctors and nurses who are putting their lives on the line to look after us, that they're actually the people who spread the disease in order to make more money. That's even one of the conspiracy theories that's circulating. And then persisting and calling this the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus is a tremendous disregard for science, because it directs attention away from the real measures that one needs to take to contain it, and instead directs attention to national barriers and walls that aren't going to keep us safe, because viruses don't respect those.
Very interesting. It's 5:14. I was asked to conclude this session by 5:10. Do you have another minute to answer another question?
Of course I do.
I'll ask two other questions. One of them is from the audience, and
as long as I can answer the question.
I am sure you're the most qualified person to answer these questions. The question goes like this: the public seemed to be more compliant to public health efforts using masks and and closing businesses in 1918. Mm-hmm. Why do you think things have changed in 2020?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I lived in Italy throughout the winter and spring. I, in fact, had coronavirus myself, and a mild case, I'm very happy to say. And one of the things that I noted was messaging, that the Italian prime minister went nationally, announced the measures that were going to be taken, and explained to the whole of the public there was one message, and the message is that we have limited tools. This is what we have to do if we're going to enable our country to survive, our friends, our families, our neighbors, and ourselves, that we have to stay at home. We have to wear masks. We have to practice social distancing. This is regrettable, but it has to happen. And what was extraordinary was that people complied. I felt this in lines outside supermarkets where I heard people talking, oh, is this what it was like during the Blitz in London? We're all in this together. This is a national sacrifice. We don't like this, but we have to do it. And similarly, the Rome newspaper, Il Messaggero, said, this is the first time in 3,000 years of the history of Rome that the people have ever been obedient. And I think that this contrasts entirely with the cacophony that we heard in the United States, where a president and White House say one thing, the president's advisors say something different. We have 50 different governors, and then we have counties that take different measures, and then school boards take still different measures. The CDC was clearly not prepared for this, and became less so as it was put under great political pressure and strain. I think that this is part of the story of why things got so bad, is this distrust, this lack of a single coherent message telling people what they need to do. We didn't have a central direction or plan, and we didn't have a single voice telling people, an informed, now I don't mean any voice, I mean an informed voice following what the best scientific public health and science say should be done. That was what was lacking here. And we had this cacophony of messages, and many of the messages had very little to do with science as we know it.
Very interesting. So the last question actually is from me, and I can't resist but ask this question because I think you're an authority and your response would mean a lot to me. You know that in our country, wealth disparity has been on the rise over the past few decades. During the pandemic, we have read, and I think there is ample evidence, that people from lower income brackets, including underrepresented minorities, have fallen victim to the virus more than others. Do you predict that on the other side of the pandemic, we will see even the wealth disparity gap becoming wider?
Oh, yes, that is an enormous problem and an enormous danger. And one of the things that we have to remember is constantly to be thinking about the lessons of how did we reach this terrible point. And one of the reasons we're where we are today, which is not a good place to be, is that we have these dreadful disparities built into our society, and that if something isn't done to correct that, if we don't have a movement towards greater equality and to minimal standards of living and conditions and access to healthcare for everyone, then we're going to be, it will be like insisting on fighting the last war all over again. In fact, possibly with worse weapons than we had to fight this time. So I think that it's a question that I can't say for certain will be addressed, but I think that someone like Dr. Fauci could brief the Congress again on the fact that one of the reasons that this disaster happened to us was the terrible ethnic, racial, and economic disparities in our country, and that this needs to be addressed, and why it's not simply a matter of humanitarianism and ethics, although it is those. We should do it for those reasons, but it's also a manner of enlightened self-interest. Because if the disease is able to take root in the most vulnerable people amongst us, no one is going to be safe. One of the lessons of this pandemic and one of the lessons of globalization, like it or not, is that we're all in this together. And until we make a world where everyone is safe, no one is safe.
Fantastic. I'm glad I asked this question. Dr. Snowden, I just can't thank you enough. This talk was fascinating. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and perspectives with us today. And you just made the President's special lecture series on pandemics more interesting than we had imagined it would be. I know that because of the pandemic, we are all limited in the amount of traveling we do, but we hope you will find an opportunity to visit our campus, and I'll be delighted to spend some time hosting you here. Thank you again.
I would love to do that. And thank you for the invitation. And I thank everyone for listening and for the wonderful questions that you asked.
We appreciate it very much. In conclusion, I'd like to make an announcement. First of all, a number of people have been sending questions asking whether this lecture will be recorded and made available, and the answer is yes. We will notify you when the lecture is available on our website. But I also wanted to remind the audience that on December 2nd, we have another lecture in this lecture series by Dr. Maya Majumdar of the Harvard Medical School, who will present a lecture on modeling the COVID-19 pandemic using statistical and machine learning methods. So we go from history to computer science. So please stay tuned for more information, and I look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you again, and thank you, Dr. Snowden, for a fantastic talk.